Okay, so 17A is are the reptiles, class Reptilia. Their skin, if you've ever felt a lizard or a snake for that matter, because they're in the same category, you'll notice that they're dry. They don't feel moist. Like remember, I think I told you yesterday that like a salamander, I remember they were cold and clammy.
Are we going to
And,
this?
just right there is fine. Yeah, it still feels cool because remember they are the same temperature as their surroundings. So even though the temperature in this room is, what is it, 73 degrees, if you put your hand on the table, does the table feel cool? Okay, well that would be like if you were touching a lizard at room temperature, it's going to feel cool because that's what it feels like. That temperature actually feels like to us. And it is leathery-like, okay? It's a lot stiff, I would say stiffer, because they can still move around, but they're not, it's not as soft and movable like is the skin for a frog or something like that, okay? And it does contain keratin, which for us, keratin makes up our nails, right? Some of you maybe have tried to, add things to your nails to toughen them and things like that, and you'll look for certain ingredients that make your nails stronger. Now, another thing is reptiles will also shed. It's not the same thing, or not for the same reason as, like we talked about, others will molt. Like the insects, they have to molt to be able to grow. They shed because their skin is getting maybe a little bit worn and tattered, and they then shed that layer, and they usually look for something that will help to drag that skin off. I forget who it was. I had one of my students last year at the beginning of the year brought in some, I think this is probably from a garter snake. I think this is the head right here. He crawled out through there, and so they'll just shed the skin, and they have another skin obviously right underneath it. It doesn't have to harden like it did, like when we talked about insects and things like that. So they shed, so they're nice and fresh again. And the skin does help them regulate their body temperature to a little bit. Remember, they don't have any way of generating body heat, so but it does help to hold in body heat when things get cooler, or maybe prevents them from warming up too fast if it's getting hot. Reptiles can do some really interesting things to deal with really hot temperatures. One of the videos I remember showing to my students at Kansas City Christian, so it's an old movie, but on it, it was called The Sands of Namib. That's at least the way we pronounce it here. And the Namib Desert is kind of like on the west side of Africa, kind of north, you can imagine like northwest of maybe like South Africa, kind of up there. It's right next to the coast, and there are some lizards there that in the heat of the day, because deserts typically get pretty hot during the daytime, when they run, they have 4 legs, but they don't put all 4 legs on the ground at any one time when they're running across the sand. They'll hold one leg up in the air to keep it cool, and then they will alternate, so every once in a while they'll rotate around so that one of the legs is always up in the air staying cool, so they don't warm up too much. So it's kind of interesting the way God's created them to deal with heat in different ways. When it comes to reproduction, they have internal fertilization, which means then mother keeps the egg inside her, dad deposits sperm inside her body to fertilize the egg, and then she will lay the egg. Like in this case here, we have some sea turtles. She will come up out of the ocean, out onto the beach, far enough up onto the beach, dig a hole in the sand, and she'll turn around and put her back in there and deposit her eggs into the sand, and then cover it a little bit of sand over the top of it so predators won't run off with the eggs. But when they hatch out, as this one is right here, it will, just instinctively, they know which way it is to the beach, and they're headed to the beach. And they often hatch out at very much the same time. And so there'll be this mob of these headed to the beach. Remember, one of the things we said that for survival is safety in numbers? So yeah, there might be one little guy that doesn't make it because some bird of prey picked him off, but most of it are going to make it. Now, if they were all scattered, one going there one at a time, maybe very few would make it. But in large numbers, they can make it. Okay. Now they have an egg that is amniotic egg, and we'll get that on a next slide, I think, or one of the next slides, of what we mean by an amniotic egg. The amniotic egg, yes, it has a shell. Now, since this is a reptile, they don't have hard shells like bird eggs or like chicken eggs. They have a more flexible outside. It's tough, but it does have a shell. They have a chorion in which the little developing embryo will grow inside of that. So that's the embryo that will grow into whatever reptile this happens to be. Then they have an amnion. The embryo is inside the amnion, and then it's connected to this part right here, which is the yolk sac. Now, normally when you eat chicken eggs, they're unfertilized. Okay? The hen just continues to lay eggs. Even all they need to have is just a rooster present. The rooster doesn't have to mate with the chickens. They just still make eggs. One thing I learned, I think it was last week, there's a guy in my prayer group who lives, I think, down along the Platte River, but they have chickens, and when it gets really dark in winter, if they don't supplement the light, the chickens will reduce the number of eggs that they lay. So they've discovered that if they can keep them exposed to light for at least 14 hours a day, then they will produce the maximum number of eggs. I don't know, past that probably doesn't make any difference. The chicken will need to rest at some times too. So this is nourishing the growing embryo. This kind of functions sort of like what we've talked about, the placenta that you developed with inside your mother's womb that was attached to her. Well, they're not attached to mom, they're only attached to the yolk. And that's where they get their nourishment from their yolk. The yolk is going to slowly get smaller and smaller and smaller as they use it up, as they grow bigger and bigger and bigger. And then other parts, there is a little airspace. If you ever notice that when you boil an egg and you open it up, there always has kind of an indentation on the end. That's where gases are exchanged between the embryo and the atmosphere. So, and the shell is kind of porous to let oxygen in, and then ultimately into here, and carbon dioxide will go into here and out into the atmosphere. So that's what its purpose is, to allow oxygen exchange. So they still have to get oxygen because they're still alive. The reptiles have lungs, so they breathe with lungs, like we talked about amphibian having lungs during only part of its life cycle. They have it their entire life cycle. They have lungs. They have, though, a 3-chambered heart. They have 2 atria. They have left and right atria, and then they have 1 ventricle. In our body, in mammals, this bottom wall, which we call a septum, remember we used that word, I think when we were studying about the earthworm. Septum is what divides one segment from the next. Well, we use that, anything that divides, a wall that divides is called a septum. This septum doesn't go all the way to the, fully to the other side. It's only part way. So it's still all one chamber. If this were all the way to the end, then it would be a regular four-chambered heart. So, but by being there, it does cause this blood to not mix as much with this blood over here. It does help to keep it somewhat separated. One will be flowing in one side, on the other side, but the two sides aren't blended. Okay? So that ventricle on the bottom is partially divided by a septum. Now, are there some reptiles that actually do have four-chambered hearts? Yes, I think it's, I forget, it's the alligator or the crocodile. I think it's the crocodile actually has four-chambered heart. Yep, there it is. Okay? Crocodiles have a four-chambered heart. So that septum is all the way, divides the ventricle into two ventricles instead of just one. They also, if we're talking about a snake, they have a special organ called a Jacobson's organ. And if this is typically poisonous snakes, they have these little pits that are located right in front of their eyes, and they can smell with those. They also use their tongue to sense their environment. So that the reason why the snake sticks its tongue out is not mad at you or anything. He's sensing his environment with his little forked tongue. Okay, so in the reptiles, they have orders as well. It's kingdom, phylum, class, Reptilia, and then we have these orders. Squamata are the snakes and lizards. Snakes and lizards fit into that one. Then we have Testinata. Those are the any kind of turtle or tortoise. And then we have Crocodilia, how do you say that? Are the alligators and the crocodiles. Now, does anybody know that when you look at them, how do you distinguish one from the other? A crocodile or a alligator? In the U.S. we have alligators, right? In other parts of the world, they often have, the more common is to find the crocodiles. Okay, we have alligators, they have crocodiles. What's the difference? Are more likely to live in seawater, yes. Alligators always live in fresh water, and then also the crocodiles are the ones with the really long snouts, and alligators typically have a short mouth compared. Okay, you're dismissed.